All right. Do you want to segue or start?
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should probably segue. Do we do an intro? How does this show go? Hi, welcome to Hey, Look at My Thing with Aaron Irons, Keegan Reynolds, and me, Rachel Bennett. On this podcast, we share things we're enthusiastic about with our friends, and this week we are sharing Tiny Beautiful Things, advice on love and life from Dear Sugar. So this question is gonna be great, but what do you guys already know about this thing?
Literally nothing. I have never, aside from you introducing us to the fact that we would be going over this, I have no idea what this is.
I was actually thinking about it today. I saw the subject and I was like, what is that? Like, not like, what is it like about? Like, I don't know if it's a podcast, a book, a video, a game. I was like, I have no idea what this thing is, just even in the generalist of terms.
Cool. So I love that you are both starting off as precious, clean little new babies and have absolutely no idea. There's some facts of this that I think it's kind of worthwhile to the experience to obscure a little bit toward the end. But just for a brief overview. So Tiny Beautiful Things is a book for what it's worth, Keegan. So let's start there. It is something that was actually assigned to me in college by a really great professor, Dr. Varallo, who I had some of my communications classes with. It was for an interpersonal communication class. When she assigned it, I was like, what the fuck are we doing with this? And by the end, I was like, I don't even care because I'm very into this whole scene. It came out in 2012. And basically the conceit of the book is that the column, Dear Sugar, was an online column in like a very kind of, like a very kind of bougie internet forum thing. There was like this website that was built as an online community focused around literature. So it's important going into this that like one of the questions that she gets asked a lot, the advice columnist in question, is like, hey, did you write these letters yourself, or did you like edit them a lot or clean them up? And she always says, no, these are things that came to me and I got a lot of letters, so I sort of picked ones that were better written. But it's important to know, as like part of the premise, that this was around a community built around literature. So these people are already readers. A lot of them are already writers. A lot of the questions she answers come from writers. So that is something going in. It's sort of a weird thing. So they built this thing and they were like, we're going to do an advice column. And the guy who actually started it before the current or the writer that we'll read from took over, had like a weird inside joke with his friend that he says he's not going to belabor the goofy homoeroticism of, where this friend in emails only addressed him as Sugar Butt. And by friend, I mean like the editor-in-chief of this website. So it got shortened, he says mercifully, to Dear Sugar. So Dear Sugar was this kind of like long-running column on this website, and he didn't have time for it anymore and also needed to make money, which is not something that the column or the website was really doing much of. And so he handed it off to his friend. And he said that she was one of the only people who had written a fan letter to the column. And also he really admired sort of the way that she worked through problems. It's a fascinating, but not particularly cheerful read. If this is something that you like get into and plan on continuing reading, or if this is something that you, our listener at home, are planning on picking up, one, I cannot recommend it enough. It's just, yeah, we'll get into that later. I can't recommend it enough, but there is sort of a content warning for basically everything traumatic. I mean, she answers questions from real people who are struggling with real trauma and real issues. There's death of parents, death of children. There's sexual assault. There's interpersonal violence and marital violence. And there's a lot. It's a lot. And I wouldn't recommend binging through the whole book in like a day or anything. Because it can get pretty heavy. That said, I think that she's pretty notable for the way that she handles those problems. And I have never been like an advice column girl. Like, you know how in like the local paper or whatever, there's that like Dear Abby column that's syndicated.
Mm-hmm.
I have never looked at that and not said like, this is complete horseshit.
You know what's interesting, though? A little quip about Dear Abby. She was very ahead of her time in terms of like civil rights and the like. I think somebody, and of course this would be my main takeaway, somebody wrote something along the lines of, you know, oh, I think my son's gay, what should I do? And she was like, love him like you would love anybody else. Just matter of factly, like, duh, to do the right thing.
So good.
So when are these things from? Like,
so she took over the column in 2010, and then this book was published in 2012. So we can assume that most of these things are between 2010 and 2011, because there's really not, I mean, like there's not a lot of time in between there to like get everything together in a book. No, it's already written, so they could have gone slightly longer than that. She doesn't date them all. I will say, like she says in the book, although not necessarily in a section that we're reading, because we're just reading an excerpt today. I've pulled a couple of examples that I think highlight things that she does really well or are spectacularly well written, or that I thought would like connect with us based on like what I know about who we are as people. So all of them do at least one and sometimes more than one of those things. But she did the column for 2 years. It ended in 2012, just a couple months before this book was published. And then afterward, she sort of like revealed who the person behind Sugar was and like made that more public, which we'll get to. And then actually now, so people were like clamoring for it because they knew who this like anonymous advice giver was, so they could like send direct emails and be like, yo, please. So she started up a podcast that ran for 4 years, from 2014 to 2018. And it was produced by the New York Times, actually. And then in follow up to that, really recently, just in April of this year, she started a new podcast called Sugar Calling, where she does like Google Hangouts with people during the like pandemic times, because people are so extra like, what the fuck? And she has like questions with different authors who are like older. It's really interesting. So yeah.
All right. Well, I'm excited about it.
Me too.
Yes. So in your email, you have like a collection of excerpts. So we'll just, read through and then come back and talk about any that we found interesting, and we'll make it happen.
Sounds good. See you guys on the other side.
Yup. Hey guys, it's me again. So, my first recommendation before I get into my charity of the week is take care of yourself. Take a break. Do something that you enjoy. Or if you can't remember what you enjoy, do something new that you've never tried before. After you've taken a break, if you still have a little bit of extra energy in you and a little bit of extra money that you're just looking for a home for, my charity of the week this week is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They are a grassroots mental health organization, and they do a lot of outreach, not just in things like suicide prevention, but also in destigmatization and working with teens and young adults to make sure that they understand things like having mental health issues is as common as having physical health issues, and therapy is rad and you shouldn't be embarrassed of it, which are all pretty important things for young adults and adults to know. So they do a lot to help kind of spread out and get that outreach. You can give to them at NAMI.org, and they are definitely worthwhile if you have a little extra. Like always, if you don't, that's okay. We love you. Love yourself, and we will catch you next time. All right. So we're back after some slight farty mouth horse noises. Yeah, let's start off. This one's kind of hard to start off with a summary, but let's start off with a summary. Sort of what did we see? What did we read about, boys?
So I think it was 5 or 6 or 7. Actually, it might have been 7 or 8 entries, basically, letters asking for advice, and then her response to those letters. Some were long, some were short. I think how big of a book is it?
So the total book has a run time, if you will, of just over 350 pages. So it's a pretty average novel size. I think there's approximately, I'm going to pull a number out of my ass here. I think there's approximately 30 of these entries. Probably a little more than that, probably closer to 40, I guess. There's 5 parts and about 8 to 10 entries in each part. So you're looking at 40 to 50 of these. I would call them vignettes. They're very, very, very small, short stories almost. But yeah.
So they are definitely really heavy topics.
Yep.
We started with divorce. Sort of. I guess that wasn't the main topic. The real topic that he was getting at is he is post-divorced and asking about he's unable
Expressing
to say
love.
Yeah, unable to say I love you to any other partner he's ever had. And yeah, that one definitely hit me right in the gut. If you could just ram a battering ram right into my stomach with that one. I definitely want to return to talk about that, but I want to table that for right now.
For sure.
There was
maybe
one
some
about,
overall stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of covers that letter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was one about a miscarriage, and the return letter was very lengthy and talked about counseling girls, high risk teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And that one, while not necessarily something that hit me in terms of things I've experienced, was still really heavy again. And the vicarious trauma that it explored was hard
Intense.
to swallow.
Yes. Yeah.
And I really like how she connected those two things. They were very, very different things, but there was a really important line about not just stopping and just continuing forward, because no one is going to make that right. Nothing is going to be made right, that you just have to keep going even though something bad happened. Nothing is going to fix this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There were a couple more quippy and actually a couple of them made me smile in terms of there was one about especially towards the end, a girl who is pretty much getting around quite a bit and feeling a bit guilty about it. I thought that was kind of interesting. There was another one where, not getting unrequited love, essentially. There was one that actually the advice I didn't necessarily agree with.
Ooh, I'd love to talk about that.
Right. There was one about a guy who considered himself ugly.
Yes.
And, the advice. So he said, I'm ugly. I'm never going to find romantic love. What is your advice? Should I just give up or should I keep trying? And the advice that Sugar gave was, never stop trying to just, you will find somebody eventually. And I'll be honest, it kind of felt too optimistic to me.
Yeah.
See, this is where I think she made a kind of a distinction. It was real subtle there, but she says, if it's something you want, don't stop trying for it.
Right.
And he had obviously written this letter, so it's in his mind that this is something he wants. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken all this effort to do it. So I think she's going from the point of view of obviously this is something he wants in his life, and if you do want this in your life, do go for it.
Yeah. And so I think she says in this one, although there's another letter in the book that is sort of similar to this one, except the person in question is like a very old man who is like pursuing someone who is younger than him by a pretty substantial margin. And she says, like, I can't guarantee that you are going to find love. Like, I can't tell you, oh, this will definitely happen. You just have to like stick through. But like, if you close yourself off and don't even try, I can guarantee that you will not.
Yeah.
And so like that's sort of the set of choices that you're left with is I can try and maybe never, or I can decide not to try and definitely never and give up on this thing that's important to me.
Right. And that's exactly the part of it that I do agree with and I do understand. But I guess the part that was missing, and maybe it's not appropriate to give that pep talk and be like, well, also you might never see the fruits of your labor.
Right.
But I think it also is very important. Like when I went to therapy and grief counseling, we talked about that I was trying really hard to replace my ex-husband, and that I was bound and determined to fix this. And we landed on, not only, giving me encouragement that it's important to try, but one thing she said that stuck with me was that there's no guarantee you will find that. And it is also very important to accept that it might be the case that you don't end up with somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to tell somebody. I don't know if it's always the right thing to say, but it's important if that person doesn't, and in my case didn't, come to terms with that. That's made very clear that you need to love yourself first, and you need to.
I think there's a managing expectations sort of point to it that she didn't get. She probably didn't hit quite as hard. Like, hey, it's like if like you have to really weigh the importance of this to you with the amount of time, work, effort, bad times that are going to happen because of that effort. Like, which one is, like, you have to weigh that. Like, is it worth it for you to get that thing that you want to go through all this stuff? And if it is really important to you, then it will be worth it. If it's not, well, then there's a different conversation we need to have.
Yeah, and there's different levels of success. Like, while looking for replacing, I found a lot of friends, and I've had deeper relationships with people, but I certainly have not fixed that part of my life. And I don't see that as a disappointment. I see that as, it's not going to stop me from trying, but I feel like the effort I have put in has still gotten me a positive impact in my life.
Right.
Well, overall, I really I enjoyed this. Like, I know there were a lot of heavier topics, but it didn't really feel like it didn't leave me feeling sad. It left me feeling kind of light and hopeful just for people in general. I really liked how she was, she was friendly and she was familiar and she shared of herself to to get people to kind of understand what she was thinking and feeling when she's answering these questions. Not just, I'm going to answer your question. It's like, this is how I came to answer this question. This is the mentality that I brought with it. She was also, very funny in several occasions. And the way she wrote, I don't know if because this might have been a formative thing for you, but I found a lot of Rachel in just kind of her tone and the playfulness of a lot of things. And I did really enjoy the one part that really got me emotionally was at the end of the miscarriage letter when she met the girl at the Taco Bell. That one got me. I like that.
Yeah, so this was a book that I read in my last year of college. So by the time, in fact, in my last trimester, we were on trimesters, but in my last trimester of college. So by the time I was reading this, I had already student taught for about 6 months total. And I was in a big city school. I was deep in the middle of it. I had a lot of kids from a lot of backgrounds that you don't see as much in our small town. And that particular story hit me so fucking hard. Like, I remember the first time I read it in class. I think I had probably not read it for the homework assignment and was like reading it while she talked. I remember feeling like I had just been hit by a fucking truck. Like, that one got me really hard. But I appreciate you saying that she sounds kind of Rachel-y. I think the thing that I don't know if I took from this or I've like become somebody who believes in this, but the thing that strikes me about the way that she writes is that she is honest, but not unkind. She calls it radical empathy, which is like a very Brene Brown way to describe it.
Right.
But like the idea of it is that you extend sort of belief and care and understanding in every way that you can. And she also talks about unconditional positive regard, which is something that I hold really near and dear to my heart, where no matter what somebody tells you, or no matter what somebody admits, or no matter what somebody has going on in their life, you always assume that that person is a good person and that they want to be a good person and that they want to better themselves. And that is really fucking hard.
Yeah,
really, it's so easy for me to do with my kids. Right? Like when I have a teenager come into my room and they've made a mistake, right? It is so easy for me to return that with empathy and return that with unconditional positive regard, because I do love my kids, all of them, even the ones who fuck things up and are sometimes racist. I love them. I do. It's really hard for me to do that with an adult though, because I feel like you should fucking know better, especially like adults in a position of power, right? Like that's something that I struggle with more and more and more every goddamn day, where it's really hard. It's really hard to return that.
I would say, jumping off of that, like I'm a really critical person, and I really think about a lot of decisions before I make them. And in retrospect, I feel like I can look back and say like I've made a lot of good decisions. And so when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I messed things up, my first thing is to put my head in my hands and be like, why weren't you thinking? Right. And that's not the right reaction. The right reaction is, like you're saying, is unconditional positivity. Is that what I'm thinking?
Unconditional positive regard.
Unconditional positive regard.
Yep. Which is like, I'm not going to tell you that everything's going to be okay, because I can't guarantee that, but I'm going to tell you that I love you anyway.
Right.
And like, that's what unconditional positive regard is about.
Yeah. Coming from a place of empathy, is really important for me, just when dealing with people. It just, I don't know. I found that it has made my interactions with people, my relationships with people, if I really focus on coming from a place of empathy and compassion before everything else, it seems to work so much better.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, people really respond to that. I mean, I think that's another thing that you can take from her story about like mentoring those students is that, you know, she started off with this, you can tell me anything. And then they told her some things and she was like, okay, I love you anyway. And they kept telling her things and they trusted her and they loved her back and they wanted to be like her and they wanted to be a part of her life. And like, it's something that they're just is not and honestly cannot be enough of in the world. And so the fact that she brings it to people with such clarity in these letters, I think is why, even though there's a lot of trauma, actually one of the really early stories in this book that I did not include, she talks at length about her own sort of history with sexual trauma. And it's heavy. I mean, it's not good reading. It's not light reading. It was familial. It was awful. She was incredibly young, like 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. Yeah. And it's terrible. And at the end of it, you go, God, but you don't feel terrible because of the way that she presents it and the way that she uses that to help people and talks about, hey, this was really hard and it sucked to work through. And I got to a point where this is where I am with it. And it sounds like this is where you are with what you're going through. And this is, you know, how you can take that out into the world and make it something that will never be okay and will never have a purpose behind it, but does add something crucial to your life in a not negative way. And I think like the empathy that she brings to people, even when she's kind of a hard ass, there's a letter in here where someone writes her and he's basically like, am I the asshole? What's going on? And she's like, yeah, you're the asshole. That's pretty much it.
Yep.
You're being kind of an idiot, my dude. Like, let's get our shit together. Even in times like that, like she does it with no question about that unconditional positive regard, right? She likes you anyway. She still cares for you. Yeah, you're being the asshole. People are the asshole sometimes. Sometimes she's been the asshole. She understands that sometimes it's hard to not be the asshole, but you're being the asshole and it's time to stop. Like, it's such a unique way of interacting with somebody who is struggling. And it's so refreshing that even though things are heavy, it doesn't feel like, to me, it's never felt like this book has weighed me down.
Well,
all right, bring it, Aaron. Let's go. I'm ready.
So when you had brought up that, because I didn't know that this was going to be really heavy material going in. So right when you brought that up, I was feeling kind of nervous and tense. Mm-hmm. And the first 2 letters hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I had to take a couple breaks because I just could not continue reading. And that's part of the reason why it took me longer than you guys, I'm sure, is just like I just couldn't do it for a little bit. I was on the verge of like texting you guys and saying like, I don't know if I can get back in here and record right away because I was feeling like it would be really hard to talk about. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the first letter, I'm kind of far. So the first letter was about divorce, and honestly, I'm far enough away from it. It's not like I'm having panic attacks anymore, but you know, grief comes in waves, and definitely reading that, it felt like I was drowning a bit. It was really hard to get through. So, but I don't want you to think that I didn't appreciate that and find it important, because it is.
Yeah, the thing that stuck out to me about that letter in specific, and that is the actual that is the first letter in the actual book. The first 2 that we read are the first 2, and I thought that they did a couple of things. The first is that they really showed what kind of energy she brings to people, and how she kind of interacts with people. And also I think that both of the sort of themes that those focus on, or the main ideas that those focus on, are things that are really isolating universal experiences, right? Like getting out of a relationship and being like, you know what, love is bullshit actually. And I'm not into the promises that you make that somebody is absolutely going to betray you on. And I'm not into the whole fucking thing. Fuck all of that. Like I'll fuck around with people or whatever because I like having people around. But seriously, fuck this whole love bullshit and the greeting card industry and fuck everything. Like I think that everyone has kind of like had that punk rock moment, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just, it is a thing. And it might have been, it can be a long relationship where you were married to someone and you thought like, this is it, right? And then it wasn't in a really disastrous way. And it can be even like a familial relationship. Like if you have a parent who betrays your trust really deeply, it could absolutely be that, or a sibling or a best friend, or if you waste almost 3 years of your high school life on a guy who's a rapist. Like these things happen. Anyway, these things happen. Like we fall into people who end up being a bad idea, and that's just a thing. But like realistically, we don't stop loving people. We can stop calling it that, but that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's not like, you know, oh, I had this really bad relationship and now I don't give a shit about my friends anymore. Like that's not how that works. So it's interesting for me. And even as somebody who has like moved well and truly moved on from the relationship that I had that made me like, fuck everything. Like really well and truly moved on and been very lucky in what I have now. Like it still struck me the way that she talked about like, that isn't the end all be all. And when you say love to someone, it doesn't have to mean like you're the best and I'm committed to you forever and everything's going to be perfect all the time. You can choose to give that a different meaning, and that's okay. Like that's big. Like I don't think that's a way that we talk about or think about love. We think about it as this like all-encompassing, unconditional, absolutely ironclad thing, which is fucking dumb because like everyone by the age they're 12 knows that it really isn't. Like it isn't.
Right. I think you're right, and I wanted to just dive into that a little bit deeper, where I love you isn't necessarily a forever thing, but it's how I feel in this moment. And I think that I found that very daunting and very scary, just because I don't want to break a promise.
Right.
And so I don't want to say something that I'll have to eat my words on later. And that's why it's really hard to say those words. But I think the context that she put it in, it's really important to say them to the extent that you do mean them.
Right.
Yeah, and explain what they mean when you're saying them. She was very specific. It's like, tell her you love her, but tell her what that means to you right now so she understands what you're saying.
I love the quote for that is, describe the particular kind of, oh shit, I didn't mean to fall in love, but I sort of did love you appear to have for her.
Yeah, it's
I really like that quote.
Yeah.
If you say I love you and you don't explain, then you're just kind of deciding, or you're not deciding what they're going to think of that word. They have their own ideas. They have their own opinions. Unless you are clear about that, you could get into some serious trouble by saying that and not showing exactly who you are when you do.
It's important to qualify and not over qualify, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think it's fascinating how she talks about like drug addicts that stop maturing emotionally when they start using, which I'm not sure I agree with, but like I haven't known many drug addicts. But the thing where she says in long-time monogamy, our definition of love can get stuck at what it was in the beginning of that relationship and just not move. That was really interesting to me.
I wrote that quote. That was the first quote I wrote down. I suspect a piece of yourself is still frozen there. Because that really resonated with me.
Yeah, it's like a hard thing to look at kind of the definition you've had of what that is, especially when your definition of what a specific type of love is has included something that was or has become trauma, right? To look at your definition of what that is and say, maybe this definition is outmoded. Maybe this isn't the way that it has to be, is really hard and takes a lot of introspection that I think people aren't inclined to do or really think critically about unless somebody pushes them in the way that Sugar pushed this person, because we just sort of accept, right? You know, when it's love, you'll feel it. It's right. Like, this is the narrative that we have, but like, that's bullshit. Like, if the 50 letters, 100 letters, whatever in this book are any kind of proof, you will not know. You will have no idea, and it will be confusing and messy and painful and wonderful, and there will be a lot going on that you have to kind of like dig through and sort through and really think about if you're going to do that in a way that's healthy. Now, you can go with the flow and just like write it out, but odds are that's going to cement some shit that you don't really want cemented. Right. And so I love that she is like explicit about, look, you need to take the time to think to yourself, what does this mean to me? And how is this affecting the way that I'm viewing the world? Because we're not pushed often enough to just do that.
Yeah. And like when you were talking about being frozen in love, that could, like, it could almost come from a positive place. Like,
absolutely.
Like, at the beginning of the relationship, your love was like this, and they have happy memories about it, and everything's good, and that has changed and evolved, and you're like, oh, I've lost that thing. It's like, so you're comparing it to what in your mind, it's like, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what it needs to be now. It's like, no, it's different now. Doesn't mean it's bad now. Doesn't mean it's worse, better. It's different, and you have to be able to grow with that word and grow with what it means to you.
Right. It's like a year and a half or whenever you move in together tends to be like a really common place for people to be like, am I still in this relationship? Because things change. Right? It's just different. Yeah. You know now that he throws his towels on the fucking floor and that makes you nuts, right? Like, you know now that it turns out his family is actually batshit insane and you're not sure you want to deal with that. You know now that, like, sometimes he makes really dumb kind of off-color jokes and you're not super into it. And you've stopped, like, going out on dates as often and things have stopped being adventures as often. And, like, that's super normal. But it doesn't feel normal, especially if you're coming from like short-term relationship, long-term relationship. And then moving into that, what it really means to be long-term shifts things so much that like coming out of that is a lot. It's just a lot. And like you have to reintegrate a lot of parts of yourself to make room for somebody else to be there for an extremely long time. And like, the parts that you shift around are still shifted around. So then you're like, well, do I shift this shit back? Was this a good shift? There's a lot of sorting. And it's clear that he is like doing that sorting and isn't necessarily cognizant of it. And that takes a lot of like time and mental energy that could be devoted to a shiny new relationship, but maybe shouldn't be, but maybe should be. Who can say? Yeah.
I think also, you had mentioned going from short-term to long-term, and kind of bouncing off of that idea, going from long-term to anything else, like extremely long-term. Yeah. You tend to really hone in on the things that are missing that you just expect and forget all of the quirks and bullshit and abuses that you endured for that time. And, you know, when somebody does something that is totally opposite of what you expect, you almost have, what's that disorder where you fall in love with your captor?
Stockholm syndrome,
yes. Like you kind of have that ingrained in you. And then anybody who's nicer to you is too nice. And anybody who, you know, does things differently that are not quite the same as you expect are just not enough. And it's hard to break out of that and say, this is different, but it is enough.
Right. Yeah. And even to like redefine what enough means through the context or the lens of another person is really challenging. Like, what is enough now compared to when I was 16, right? What is enough now compared to 2 years ago, Like that definition should be shifting, and redefining it takes a lot of work and a lot of thought and a lot of being really brutally honest with yourself in ways that aren't necessarily particularly comfortable. It's
Well,
I did remember the why, like one more reason why it reminded me of Rachel when I was reading that. Besides just the tone, that just overall she's very thoughtful and earnest.
It's so sweet.
And occasionally just throwing in some swears. Those were some Rachel stuff.
There was one of the letters where I think she says the word cock like 45 times. It's like unsettling, because to me that's like kind of an inherently sort of funny word, because it's not like a thing people say. Like, I don't think that people in my sort of like age bracket authentically say the word cock to refer to a penis. Like, I don't think that's a thing. So it's like kind of an authentically funny word to me. But of course, because it's one of these Dear Sugar letters, it's like in a really traumatic context that's like really uncomfortable. So like the juxtaposition of that was very difficult for me. That's why that letter isn't in here. So I did have two things that I wanted to share that may or may not provide a little bit of context to this. The first is that I was deliberately cagey about the author of this book. And the author of this book is a woman by the name of Cheryl Strayed. I don't know if that rings a bell for either one of you.
Probably not.
No.
So the thing that she's well known for is the memoir Wild. So Wild is about her taking an 1,100-mile hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. So she started in the Mojave Desert and then went up to Washington State. And she talks more there about her mother dying, which is clearly something that like that still is a big part of her. She talks about like her siblings. She talks about her father. She talks about her divorce from her first husband. She talks about starting to use heroin. I mean, there is a lot in this book. Yeah, it's a lot. But she talks about it all as it's sort of a back and forth conversation with herself where she'll like go back to these things that have happened in her life that led her to the point where she's walking 1,100 goddamn miles of the Pacific Crest Trail, and then comes back to the actual legitimate challenges that she is facing along the trail as well, right? So it's these two very different types of challenge, and they mirror each other in really fascinating ways. If you're looking for something that is like more of a narrative arc, it is peak. But it was huge. It was massive. It was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 7 weeks when it was a hardcover. And then it was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 126 weeks when it came out in paperback.
Wow.
It's been translated into 50 languages. Oprah picked it for her book club. They made a movie of it with Reese Witherspoon.
I remember that. I remember that movie. I didn't watch it, but I remember it.
She has achieved like a moderate sort of like following because of how massively huge this book was. So that's one thing. I kind of assumed that it would not really add much to your guys' like understanding or knowledge of the book. But it is a thing. She has done other works. Again, she revealed herself as the voice behind this Dear Sugar, but it's clear that she has had like a really bizarro collection of experiences that make up her life.
But it's definitely shaped her.
Oh, yeah.
That's very reflective in the way that she was, writing back to these people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like carrying those things with her has given her the ability to respond to these people in this way. It's also interesting, like the school I was at previously was very bought into Stephen Covey's 7 Habits. I don't know if you're familiar with those at all.
Not particularly.
I think like that's the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we did the 7 Habits of Highly Successful Teens, and the presentation of them wasn't always super good. because you need like a really authentic staff buy-in. But some of the actual habits themselves were articulated in a way that made sense and were, I mean, good ideas, right? It's like super basic stuff that's actually really hard to implement in your life. Like the first one is be proactive. Like instead of reacting to things, I should plan ahead and like think about things beforehand and have a like decision going in instead of just reacting to whatever happens when it happens. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously, but it turns out that's actually super fucking hard, my dude. Yeah. But one of them was, it's called seek first to understand, then to be understood. Mm-hmm. And I really like this as a habit because it implies, or I guess explicitly states, that you should put the emphasis on listening to the other person instead of waiting for your turn to talk, which is something that conversationally, like communally, we the people are not super great at all the time. But one of the things about it was this like counseling thing where they say that when you're listening to somebody and somebody comes to you with a problem, what you're supposed to do is sort of like restate the problem back to them and not give them advice necessarily and not make it about yourself and not do any of these things. You're just supposed to like restate the problem back to them and have them sort of like work through their own stuff and express their feelings in a way where you're not being judgmental and whatever. Obviously, the not being judgmental is good, but all of that, like, well, don't tell stories about yourself has always felt to me like, how am I supposed to empathize? Like, how am I supposed to explain that your feelings are normal and they're feelings that people have and that's okay and you should be feeling them if you don't say, look, here's the thing, right? You're not alone in the universe. And I love that she does it here because it makes me feel more valid as a human being.
Right. I think there's kind of two different approaches though, right? Like there is the type of person who will listen barely and then come back with a story that may or may not relate to your story and that it's kind of their half-hearted attempt to make you feel better. But then there's somebody who really deeply like can't fall asleep at night and tells her cat that she's going to write this person and like there's that type of person who, how do I respond to this person genuinely? Yeah. And the best way is to say, you're not alone. And this is an experience that I have to tell you because it's important. But this is why this is why I'm giving you advice to do it this way, because I've walked this road and I have experience and I've experienced really terrible things in my life that, that have shaped me. And this is going to shape you too.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot about intent. Like, if you're intending to tell an interesting story about yourself, that's all that you're trying to do. If you're intending to empathize with them, well, then that story, will mean something. What you're saying will mean something. It'll connect with what they're saying. It'll be obvious that you've listened to what they're said. You're trying to understand what they said, and now you're trying to help them understand what they're going through.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Rachel, for sharing this with us. It was
it was a ride.
An experience.
Yes. I don't want to say treat, but it was I do think it was impactful, and I appreciate that you shared it with us.
Yeah, I think I would recommend, if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, or if it's something where you're in a position where you work with people who have, everybody works with people who have experienced trauma. We're human beings. We experience trauma. But if you're in the type of position where people come to you with that trauma, even if you don't end up being about radical empathy, or you don't end up being about unconditional positive regard, or you don't end up liking, the specific advice that she gives or whatever, I do think that it is worth seeing the way that she responds to people and seeing the types of things, the sort of variance in human behavior that people come to her with questions on. The full book is, I think, $11.99 on Kindle. So, that's my little plug. Yeah. Do we have a rating for this? Like teardrops out of 10?
Oh God. 11 teardrops out of 10. My eyes have actually shriveled up and died.
That feels right. Yep. Yeah.
That works for me.
All right. So I thank you both for joining me. I think next week we're sharing. Do we know? Do we know yet?
Yeah, it's me, I believe, unless we're having a guest.
No, I think it's you.
I will be sharing Gilmore Girls, one of my favorite shows of all time.
Let's talk about a drastic tonal shift. All right.
See you guys next time. Goodbye.
Bye, nerds.